At first light, the tower does not look like a mountain at all. It rises out of the plain in a single abrupt mass, its sides lined with long vertical ribs, its summit cut off so cleanly it seems less grown than severed. The base spreads outward in broken shelves and dark debris, like something that once stood higher and failed under its own weight. In old photographs, before roads and visitor rails softened the scene, the contrast is even stranger. Grassland below, flat horizon beyond. Then this colossal column, stranded and alone, as if a piece of another world had been left behind. The accepted word for it is mountain. The eye keeps refusing. How does a mountain end like that? The official explanation is familiar. Uplift raised the land. Magma intruded through older rock. Cooling created columns, wind, rain, frost. And the deep time stripped away the softer layers around the harder core, leaving an isolated monument. The same broad story is used elsewhere with a local variation. Some flat-topped heights are called mesas, the remains of once continuous layers. Some are volcanic necks. Some are erosional remnants. Some are laccoliths or plugs. The chronology is orderly. Sediment, heat, pressure, fracture, exposure, erosion. In textbooks, the sequence is precise enough to feel settled. The mountain exists because geology, given enough time, can produce forms that resemble design without requiring intention, biology, or memory. That is the official explanation. And yet there is a problem with forms that look manufactured by force and interruption. Not every mountain does, most do not. Range systems, folded ridges, uplifted blocks, volcanic cones, glaciated peaks, all fit their explanations well enough. But scattered across continents, there is another class of object that resists easy visual obedience. Vast flat tops, vertical fluting, circular or near-circular footprints, aprons of fallen material gathered around the base like stripped bark, ravines running outward in radial lines, surrounding strata that seem less like a birthplace than a buried matrix. The accepted story can name each feature separately. What it struggles to do is remove the cumulative impression. Some landscapes do not merely look eroded, they look cut. So the hidden theory begins there, not as a declaration, but as a possibility serious enough to test. What if at least some formations we call mountains are not mountains in the ordinary sense at all? And what if they are the mineralized remnants of something once vertical, once organic, once much larger than the fragment now left behind? Not every peak, not every mesa, not every volcanic tower, but a subclass of isolated formations whose geometry resembles truncation more than uplift, whose surfaces resemble fibrous structure more than random breakage, and whose setting suggests burial and exposure rather than simple construction by fire. No serious investigator should accept that claim easily, but no serious investigator should dismiss it before asking what exactly the stone is showing. Begin with shape, because shape is the one piece of evidence even a child can see. A stump has certain habits. It rises from a broader base. It narrows or straightens into a shaft. It may show vertical grain. It is often cut across near the top, leaving a surface that is flatter than the body that supports it. Around it, debris accumulates in a ring. Weather takes the outer layers first. Now set that mental outline beside the world's catalogue of isolated towers, buttes and mesas. The resemblance is not poetic, it is structural. Some formations stand not as peaks in a chain, but as single survivors in a flatter field. Some show outer flaring at the base, as if a trunk once entered ground or sediment there. Some are surrounded by lower root-like ridges or drainage lines radiating outward. It could be coincidence. Geology can produce coincidences, but the pattern begins with a visual fact. The forms are not merely tall, they are stump-like. Then there are the surfaces. In a normal mountain face, one expects chaos at scale, bedding, fractures, scree, random collapse, are varied angles shaped by different episodes of stress. Yet in certain towers the eye catches repeated vertical organization, almost like bundled strands fused into stone. The columns at Devil's Tower are explained as cooling joints in igneous rock, and that explanation is neither absurd nor trivial. but the visual effect remains unusually biological: long parallel shafts, tight packing, segmented breakage, fiber turned mineral. Even where geology accounts for the mechanism, it does not erase the resemblance. The official explanation tells us why rock can fracture into columns. It does not answer a narrower question. Why do some of the most famous isolated formations on Earth present themselves with the exact visual grammar of cut wood, bundled cane, or petrified tissue at impossible scale? Measurements deepen the discomfort. Many suspect formations are not just vertical, they are disproportionately vertical compared with their context. They rise abruptly from flatter terrain rather than graduating naturally out of a mountain system. Their tops are too sudden, their sides are too direct. Their surrounding debris fields form collars rather than continuous slopes. In cross-section, a stump is an interruption. It is the visible remainder of something that once extended farther upward. In geology, by contrast, one often expects transitional evidence connecting a feature to the process that formed it. Lava fields, feeder structures, associated cones, regional uplift patterns, erosional sequences. Sometimes those exist. Sometimes they are inferred more confidently than they are observed. What matters is not that every case lacks context, but that in several celebrated cases the context feels reconstructed after the fact. What changed was the explanation. Material evidence matters more than silhouette. If this theory were pure visual fantasy, it would collapse there. But geology already accepts a phenomenon close to the heart of the claim: petrification. Organic structures can be mineralized so thoroughly that tissue becomes stone while preserving shape, texture, even cellular patterns. Petrified wood is not controversial. Entire forests turned to stone are not controversial. Silica can replace organic matter. Iron can stain and harden it. Pressure and time can transform biomass into coal, lignite, graphite, hydrocarbons, or mineral ghosts. The Earth is full of dead biology rewritten in geological language. Once that is admitted, the boundary between organism and rock becomes less absolute than it first appears. The question is not whether living structure can become stone. It can. The question is whether scale alone has made certain candidates unthinkable. Scale is where most people stop. A petrified log the length of a truck is easy to imagine because museums already display them. A stump the size of a mountain sounds absurd because modern life offers no living comparison. But deep time does. The fossil record preserves giant horsetails, immense club mosses, fern forests, and entire ecosystems that would look alien beside modern woods. Coal beds are the compressed remains of ancient plant worlds laid down on a scale difficult to picture from the word forest alone. In periods of higher oxygen and different climate regimes, size limits shifted. As insects grew larger, plants dominated landscapes in forms no human has seen alive. None of that proves mountains are stumps. It does something more important. It removes the lazy objection that biology never operated on scales unfamiliar to us. The ancient Earth was not a slightly older version of the present. It was often another planet wearing the same name. Look at what sits around many of these formations: sedimentary blankets, coal provinces, lignite seams, petrified forests, ash layers, vast deposits of what geology treats as fuel, ore, or matrix. If the world once contained giant biological structures, later buried, cooked, flooded, mineralized, and compressed, the expected result would not be neat preservation. It would be partial survival within a transformed landscape. Most of the organism would be gone, chemically redistributed into seams, basins, and carbon deposits. Only the densest or most mineral-saturated portion might remain upright. In a tree, that would be the base, the stump. The surrounding landscape would read as geology because it would be geology. That does not weaken the theory. It is exactly what the theory predicts. The stone remembers even when the organism does not. Old maps and early survey records add another layer. Before modern geology standardized its vocabulary, surveyors often described land in blunt visual terms: towers, tables, chimneys, sentinels, knobs, monuments, stacks. These are not scientific admissions, but they reveal how the features first struck people who had no obligation to force them into a later system. Though some 19th century accounts linger over the same peculiarities, modern tourists notice immediately. Abrupt rise, sheer ribs, strange symmetry, flat crowns, isolated position. The language of first encounter often sounds less like mountain description than object description. A thing standing in a field, a remnant, a shaft, a post. The record is still there. The terminology became more technical later, but the unease remained embedded in the earlier words, as if the landscape had been seen clearly before it had been fully explained away. To be fair, the mainstream account is strong in places. Columnar basalt is real. Erosion is relentless. Differential weathering can isolate harder rock in spectacular ways. Uplift and stripping can leave mesas, buttes, monadnocks, plugs, and necks. There is no need to deny any of that. However, in many cases, the orthodox reading is almost certainly correct. A serious investigation becomes worthless the moment it pretends conventional geology explains nothing. Conventional geology explains a great deal. It explains why layers tilt, why joints form, why harder material survives, why soft surrounding rock vanishes first, why volcanic structures cool into polygons, why cliffs retreat, why plateaus break apart. If all we had were unusual silhouettes, there would be no case at all. But explanation in general is not the same as explanation in detail. The mainstream story often accounts for process while leaving proportion, isolation, and repetition strangely untouched. Why do some formations present such clean truncation at scales where natural irregularity should dominate? Thus, why do certain isolated towers carry vertical organization so persistent it overrides the eye's expectation of random fracture? Why do some flat tops look less like exposed bedding and more like a removed crown? Why do debris aprons gather like collapse around a central shaft rather than like ordinary mountain talus connected to a broader mass? And why, once one begins comparing sites, do the same visual motifs recur across regions under different geological labels? The official explanation answers each case locally. The pattern repeats globally. That wider pattern is hard to ignore once seen. In North America, isolated buttes rise out of plains like severed columns. In South America, tepuis stand as giant tables above jungle, detached from the world around them like the tops of something older. In Africa, domes and towers emerge from eroded ground, as if excavation removed the softer surroundings. In Australia, isolated monoliths and flat-topped remnants sit alone in country too open to disguise their singularity. Different continents, different rock types, different accepted histories, and yet the same broad visual class persists. Solitary masses, abrupt margins, elevated crowns, exposed vertical textures, basal spread surrounding eroded matrix. This does not prove a common origin. But it does raise a discipline question. Are we looking at many unrelated processes that happen to converge on one haunting form, or are we looking at one buried category hidden inside several different explanations? Photographs from the late 19th and early 20th centuries make the issue harder, not easier. Before grading, fencing, trails, quarry cuts and landscape management altered the bases of famous formations, many looked raw and stranger than they do now. Their lower margins appear less integrated with the ground around them, more inserted than grown out of place. In some images, the surrounding debris field reads almost like stripped material spread outward over time. In others, the upper surface appears startlingly level compared with nearby terrain. Early photographers often lingered on scale by placing wagons, men, or horses at the base. And the result is not just grandeur, it is mismatch. The human figure does not make the mountain noble. It makes it anatomically improbable. Then there is drainage, one of the quieter clues. Around some isolated formations, gullies and streams trace outward in branching radial patterns that resemble roots after exposure. Geologists explain such drainage through slope, resistance, fracture control, and local hydrology, and again that explanation is real. Yet when radial drainage converges with a widened base, vertical grain, isolated stance, and flat crown, the analogy grows difficult to dismiss as mere projection. A buried stump, exposed over ages, would not preserve wood beneath the surface. It would preserve zones of differing hardness, mineral replacement, fracture, and compaction radiating outward through surrounding material. Water would follow those zones. Erosion would reveal them. The result would not be a perfect root system frozen in stone. It would be a geological afterimage. What remains is not the organism. What remains is the pattern it left behind. Mining records and industrial history introduce an unglamorous but important dimension. Out of many of the regions surrounding these formations were not studied first as mysteries, they were studied as resources: coal, gas, timber, rail routes, quarry stone, land patents, water control, mineral rights. Once a landscape enters an economic system, it is described in the categories that system needs: seam thickness, grade, extraction cost, ownership boundary, transportation value. The tendency is not to hide anomalies dramatically, but to reduce them administratively. A strange landform becomes a mapped unit. A mapped unit becomes a legal parcel. A legal parcel becomes a managed asset. Questions that do not serve extraction or classification simply fall away. Bureaucracy is often more efficient than censorship. It does not suppress the oddity. It files it. That may be the most unsettling possibility of all. So if this theory has been overlooked, it may not be because anyone staged a grand deception. It may be because modern knowledge is organized in compartments too rigid to allow the question. Biology studies organisms, geology studies rock, paleobotany studies ancient plants at scales already accepted by prior doctrine. Surveyors map surfaces, engineers stabilize slopes, park services interpret landmarks for visitors. Each discipline inherits a vocabulary that quietly restricts what can be seen. Once a formation is entered into the record as volcanic, erosional, or sedimentary, every future observer arrives with those categories already in place. The feature is no longer encountered directly, it is encountered through an explanation. In that sense, the hidden thing is not the object, yet it is the possibility that the object belongs to the wrong file. There are other clues, smaller but persistent. Some suspect formations show concentric or quasi-concentric terrace patterns that resemble successive layers of growth or decay. Some are capped in a way that feels less like exposure and more like a cross-section. Some carry color differences from core to outer shell, suggestive of replacement rather than uniform formation. In petrified wood, preserved structure is rarely complete. Grain may distort, mineral veins intrude, silica clouds the original anatomy. Under immense pressure and immense time, no simple visual analogy should survive cleanly. And still, in several landscapes, enough of that analogy remains to disturb the official neatness. The evidence is not one decisive specimen under a microscope. It's a stack of lesser certainties leaning in one direction: form, texture, scale, context, repetition, terminology, economics, classification. The pattern does not disappear. Skeptics will say the human brain is built to impose familiar shapes on indifferent nature. We see faces in clouds, cities on Mars, design in accident. That warning is valid. It should be taken seriously. But there is a difference between seeing one resemblance and documenting a recurring package of specific traits across multiple sites. A single tower that looks like a stump means nothing. A global set of isolated formations sharing cut tops, vertical ribbing, widened bases, radial drainage, surrounding carbon-rich contexts, and uneasy historical descriptions begins to mean something, even if that something is not yet fully understood. But investigation starts exactly there, in the space between pattern and proof. The job is not to protect a theory. The job is to notice when ordinary language keeps failing in the same place. And ordinary language does fail here. We call them mountains because mountain is the largest safe word available. It carries no implication beyond height and mass. But a category can also be a disguise. Calling a thing a mountain does not settle what it is any more than calling a body a specimen explains how it died. The hidden theory asks whether certain landforms are not the products of purely geological construction, but the remnants of ancient biological architecture later processed by geological forces until only the most resistant fraction survived. That would mean the landscape contains ruins older and stranger than ruins in the human sense. Not walls, not roads, not temples, organic colossi from a world whose ordinary scale has been erased so completely that the survivors are mistaken for terrain. If that sounds excessive, consider how often accepted history changes not because new objects appear, but because old objects are seen under a different question. Fossils were once curiosities, then they became organisms. Impact craters were once volcanic scars, then they became evidence of collision. Entire cities have been walked over as hills until excavation changed the category. The object does not move, the interpretation does. What changed was the explanation. A formation can stand in plain sight for centuries while remaining conceptually invisible because the available language has no room for it. That is not fantasy, it is how knowledge often works. Now, the first barrier is not secrecy, it is plausibility. And so the stakes are larger than a single provocative image. If even a small number of these formations are mineralized stumps rather than ordinary mountains, then geology is preserving a record of a biosphere far outside the current emotional limits of accepted prehistory. Forests would need to be reimagined not as familiar woods scaled up, but as systems so vast their remains now anchor regional topography. Carbon deposits, petrified fields, mesas, buttes, towers, and isolated monoliths would begin to belong to one broader story. Some natural monuments would be monuments in a more literal sense than anyone intended. Not monuments built by intelligent hands, but monuments left by biological worlds too large to fit comfortably inside modern categories. The stone remembers. The record is still there. None of this compels belief. It compels attention. The official explanation remains powerful, and in many cases it will endure every challenge. But power is not completion. A theory should not be judged only by how strange it sounds beside today's assumptions. It should be judged by whether it organizes the visible evidence more honestly than the account it competes with. Here the visible evidence is stubborn. Truncated geometry, vertical fiber-like surfaces, isolated scale. Repeated form across continents, economic and bureaucratic habits that flatten anomalies into land use terms, disciplines arranged so that biology ends where geology begins. In that arrangement, the question never quite gets asked. Maybe these formations are only the most dramatic tricks erosion ever produced. Maybe the resemblance ends at resemblance. Or maybe an older world survives around us, in forms so large we learn to call them landscape rather than remains. The real question is not whether the theory sounds strange, but whether anyone with the tools to verify it has seriously looked.